different parts of our brains are more active when we're sleeping. So, for example, our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for our rational thought, it gets turned off when we dream. And that's part of why our dreams are just so, or can be so.
For some of it's turned off when we're awake.
Yeah, well, I agree there.
Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Nicole Chilton. She is a Springfield-based artist and writer whose creative work is strongly inspired by her vivid dream book. Her first book, How Dreams Speak, is a guide to common dream symbols. The book has been adapted into a deck of cards that will be released this July. In addition to the book, she has shown her paintings at multiple venues across Springfield, including the Sky Gallery at the Springfield-Branson National Airport, Obelisk Home, and the Creamy Arts Center. She has also taught art journaling workshops at the Springfield Art Museum and with the Springfield Greene County Library System. The arts constantly remain at the forefront of Chilton's personal and professional life. In 2005, she and her husband Dan founded the Moxie Cinema, then a one-screen art house theater located on Walnut Street downtown. Chilton has also worked for the Springfield Regional Arts Council as the Director of Marketing, and she writes freelance for local news outlets, including the Springfield Business Journal. She lives with her husband Dan and her two children, Jasper and Maggie, and their two golden retrievers, Winnie and Bowser. In today's podcast, we're going to talk about her book, the process for getting it published, which should be interesting to local authors, I should think, and finally, what it's like to make a living as a creative person here in Springfield. Nicole, welcome to In Our Town.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you're certainly welcome. Tell us about the book. Give us a thumbnail sketch.
I wrote and illustrated a book about common dream symbols called How Dreams Speak. It came out in 2021, and it's kind of a comprehensive guide looking at the history and philosophy of dreams in general, and then looking at common dream symbols, how they've come to be symbolic in people's dreams through different cultures and societies and religions, and the way that different people see these dream
What
symbols.
got you started on this?
I've been a huge fan of dream interpretation my whole life. I think I was probably in second or third grade, and I was given a dream dictionary. It has like butterflies and clocks on the cover, and I would look at it every day, and I would write my dreams down every morning that I could remember them. And so just over the years, I've always loved how dreams can be a source for creative problem solving or inspiration for a story idea or an art project or just a really fun story to tell. And so I think it was about 2017, I started through a workshop that I took with an artist based here in town, Crystal Moody, who's beyond talented. And she did this great creative workshop to help get you in the creative habit. And so I started using my dreams as a daily source of art projects.
In the first part of your book, I don't know, maybe the first 30 or 40 pages, you talk about different theories about where dreams come from, psychological interpretation, you might say. Depending on your outlook, you might say it's paranormal, or maybe it's just neuroscience.
Right.
So let's go down that list. So from a psychological perspective, I know you've done a lot of research on this. What are some ideas about where dreams come from?
One of the ones that I think is the most fascinating is that our human brains just have so much capacity that we aren't even aware of. And so we pull from our subconscious. And like you said, I did a lot of research into the different philosophies and sciences behind the different dream studies. And so I looked at Freud and Jung quite a bit because they were some of the forefront of dream interpretation. And Jung, one of his philosophies was that we all tell the same stories, no matter what culture we're in or society we're in or what our faith background is. We all have these same kind of stories that have the same archetypes. And really diving into those, one of the examples he uses is that the monarch butterfly, when they emerge from their cocoon and their chrysalis, they just instinctively know to go to Mexico for their migration. So he says that we have the same kind of instinctual process when it comes to these common archetypes and stories.
One expression you use in your book is collective unconscious.
Yes. And so we all have this well of information that we have access to, but we don't know necessarily how to get to it, but we have access to it. And so dreams is one of the ways that we're given all of that information.
And so contrast that with what Freud thought.
Freud thought that everything was pretty much just sex and nature.
Well, he was also into a lot of repression, wasn't
Right.
it? It's sort of like you can't face up to something during daytime hours, so you're going to have to deal with it in your dreams.
Right. And
Yeah.
usually the dreams were pretty lewd in his mind. I think one of the ways that Jung spawned off of that was Freud used the Oedipus Greek mythology as that we all have this kind of unspoken love or hate of one of our parental figures. And then Jung was like, well, I don't know if that's the case, but I'm paraphrasing, of course, that yes, we're pulling from these ancient stories and we all have connections to them.
Well, of course, Carl Jung was originally a disciple of Freud's, and then they
Yeah.
broke off. Where do you come down on that part of it? Do you find yourself aligning with one or the other, or not at all?
I think between the two, more for Jung, definitely. But I think as we have progressed as a society, that they're both a little bit dated and could use some updating for sure.
Uh-huh.
They're so specific on gender norms and certain family structures. And, we're an evolving society. So I think that everyone's dreams might have an overlapping commonality, but we also have to look at ourselves as the individual.
I don't mean to denigrate people that have this point of view. Just the word paranormal comes to mind. If there's a better word to characterize it, please help me here, but talk about that aspect or interpretation of dreams.
Yeah, I think paranormal, maybe metaphysical is a word that's commonly used in the same sphere, where the dreams are more divine in nature or from another source that's not necessarily our subconscious or our brain neurons.
So, for example, I think this is one of the illustrations you used in your book. If you're religiously oriented in the Bible, God talks to Joseph, and he's youngest of 12 brothers, as I recall, about what he saw in a dream, and he kind of ticked off his brothers, and they threw him into captivity, but in his dreams, they came true, and he forecast through his dreams, as I recall, the 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. So that would be an example.
Yeah,
right?
and I may start breaking out into Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat song if we keep it up too long.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that was a lot of faiths and different religions definitely use dreams as a direct conversation with their God or our God or whoever they believe in. So yeah, I think it's just so fascinating. But then again, it comes down to, regardless of faith or spiritual belief or philosophy, we all do dream. And so, that's a common denominator right there. So what we do with those dreams, I think, is more important than why we dream.
Well, you mentioned earlier that we've learned a lot in recent decades about dreaming. What do the neurologists and the neuroscience experts say about it?
I guess one of the fascinating things that I learned about when I was researching the book was that until the MRI came around, which I think was like the 1950s, the common scientific thought was that when we fell asleep, like our brains just didn't continue working the same way. And so through the MRI technology, it found out that it works in a totally different way. And so...
Well, a lot of people thought they didn't dream.
Right.
But through these MRI examinations, I guess everybody does,
Yeah.
unless they have some brain injury.
Right. And one of the things I thought was really interesting was that different parts of our brains are more active when we're sleeping, and those are the ones that are responsible. So, for example, our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for our rational thought, it gets turned off when we dream, and that's part of why our dreams are just so, or can be so...
For some of it's turned off when we're awake.
Yeah, well, I agree there. For better or for worse, I guess. But yeah, so that's why our dreams can be as nonlinear and shocking as they are versus just eating a bowl of cereal, which, those happen too. But
It seems to me we've got a spectrum here. At one end, you use your characterization. You have the metaphysical, then the psychological, and now brain science. Where are you on that spectrum?
I love learning about all of it. And I think that there's a case to be made for every single side of it. But I just genuinely really feel that our human experience, we've got more to offer than we know. And so that we do have access to this deep well of information. So I really do like the subconscious and using it to become a more whole person and learn more about ourselves and problem solving and ways to just be a better person through accessing our subconscious.
Well, I'd say we would probably call you a dream savant.
I don't know.
But
Dream enthusiast,
what's it done
maybe.
for you? You've said you've been doing this since you were a little girl. If you were going to encourage somebody, what would you tell them about your personal experience?
I think it's just been such a great way to unlock creative potential. I'm heavily involved in the arts. And so, of course, I run into a lot of people. It's like, oh, I'm not artistic. I'm not creative. And I don't believe that for a second. I think everybody is creative, and we just have to learn how to access that part of ourselves. And so I think through dreams is one way, because if someone gets really involved in telling their story about what they had a dream about, and you were just to write that on paper and send it to someone, there's, the start of a fun short story right there, or an art project. So I think on that side, it's always been a really great tool for me for creative problem solving.
I'm reminded of that expression that you hear frequently when you ask somebody to really consider something. What do they say? I'm going to sleep on it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there you go.
Because I think a lot of times you have more clarity about an issue after that.
Yeah. And, a good sleep is, I have a sign on my door, and I think a philosopher had come up with it, but it says, or it's on my office wall, actually, because I take a lot of naps in my office, but it says, shh, dreamer at work. So I count naps as work.
Let's say we have someone that's interested in the subject matter and they've picked up your book. How would you suggest they go about using it?
That's a good question. When I wrote it, I didn't expect it to be a project that someone would just sit down and read front to back. But I found that that's what a lot of people have done. So in my mind, I thought, well, people will have it at their bedside, and then the next morning, if they say, oh, I had this really strange dream and these 3 dogs were in it, that they would look up dogs and then go from there. But I found a lot of people have read through it. So then I would recommend, if you want to read through it, make sure you've got a journal with it, so that when you do wake up, you can jot down your dreams before you forget them, because that's the hardest part of remembering dreams, is as soon as you wake up, they're usually...
Does that ability to remember your dreams improve with practice?
Yes, and it's not, it, like all things, it improves with practice, obviously. And if you get out of practice, it can be hard to get back into it. I'm kind of in a space where I'm not dreaming as vividly as I had been. And when I do, it's very like day-to-day occurrences are happening in my dreams, instead of these like bizarre, fantastical worlds that I usually have. And so I wake up and I'm like, well, I already did that. And it's because I've stopped journaling in the morning about my dreams. So I think the more that you actually write down or take notes or record it into your phone or whatever method's easiest, I think that once you get into that habit, then your dreams start becoming a little bit more lucid and vivid.
Let's say you're not trying to necessarily interpret a meaning, but these dreams, they come to you via symbols, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like you're reading text off a movie screen or something. But let's just say you have some issue that you're trying to work through, figure out what you should do or not do. Is there a process for kind of preparing yourself before you go to sleep to kind of work on that issue?
Yeah, and a lot of times just even stating, I'm going to remember my dreams tonight, is enough to trick your brain into recalling it when you wake up. But I think just setting that intention before bed or before nap or whenever, that you're going to remember your dream and you want to visit some questions that you have, then sometimes I think that kind of helps.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hello, I'm Jeff Kessinger. I'm the Reader Engagement Editor for the Springfield Daily Citizen. A day in the life of the Reader Engagement Editor starts around 8 a.m., getting the newsletters, SGF AM, all ready to go, making sure the forecast is up to date for you, and gathering links from other news organizations. After that, I spend a few hours on social media. I have to schedule our posts, have to check the comments, and make sure everybody's behaving nicely. In the afternoon, I usually turn my attention to editing some of our freelance contributors, and I also do some reporting of my own on arts and culture happenings. Springfield has a great arts community, musicians, visual artists, performance artists. It's important that we give back to the arts community and thank them for the color that they add to our community and to our world. And so by reporting on events that are happening or coming up, I'm helping people find ways to connect with the artists around here.
Let's go back to Carl Jung for a second, and this notion of universality of pick a symbol. I don't know. A flower.
Okay.
That there's a high likelihood that somebody in a totally different culture would have that the flower would have the same symbolic meaning for them as for another person?
That was one of the things that was the most fascinating about my research. I just dug through so many different resources to figure out where some of these symbols came from. So like a flower, and there's all these worlds, like in Victorian time, there was florography, which was the hidden language of flowers. So if you gave somebody a yellow rose, that might mean, I can't remember off the top of my head, but something like, I'm really jealous of you. Or if you gave someone daisies, all these had these deep symbolic meanings. And of course, those don't exist in every culture. But then the general notion of a flower is something that grows and blooms and takes time, and then blooms fall apart and they decay. So there's certain parts of all the symbols that I think have a common place in all cultures. But then depending on who's interpreting it or where it's at, I think a really good example is animals. Someone could have a dream of a dog, and I love dogs, so I would think that's the best dream in the world. But if someone's terrified of dogs, then that could be a true nightmare. So I think there's some individuality in part too.
Is there at some level a connection between dream symbols and I guess I'd call them children's stories or fables?
Oh, I'm not too sure, but that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, like Hansel and Gretel and going into the woods.
Oh, yeah. Those kind of allegories and archetypes, again, go back to thinking in terms of symbolically. The stepmother usually was...
She wasn't the most lovely
I know.
person,
So,
was she?
a lot of times in those fables, they represent, one thing, and which gives stepmothers a bad name, unfortunately. But that's another part where the dreams and trying to parcel out the symbols, I can think of an example. The other day was that my daughter was talking about how a teacher she had was really mean to her that she actually really loved. And I was like, oh, well, she probably represents me because you're mad at me. So those authority figures in dreams can represent, not the person that they're showing up as.
Many people, I certainly can say whether the majority of people have a few dreams in their life that reoccur.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of those?
Recurring dreams, I think, are really great ways to problem solve. And usually, of course, depending on the severity of the dreams, and a lot of people who have suffered from PTSD or certain traumas, then their dreams might be a little bit more intense. But if we're talking about just a typical recurring dream of your teeth falling out or you missing a plane, or there tend to be anxiety dreams, recurring dreams too. And they're ways for us to prepare and be ready for the actual obstacles in our waking life. And so even though they're terrible in our evening practice, they can help us if we can use them as guides to just be more prepared in our day-to-day.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to be my therapist here for a minute.
I'll try. I signed a waiver, right?
So Dr. Chilton, sometimes my wife, I know this would be hard for a lot of people to believe, but she'll have a dream and I was a real jerk in the dream. And then she's mad at me for half the morning. And I say to her, hey, that was a dream. I didn't do anything. Now, how are we supposed to work through that?
This one's probably one of the harder concepts for me to wrap my head around. So this isn't an original thought of my own, but dream experts like Jung and Freud, they see people in dreams as an extension of yourself. So if she were to have a dream where you were really mean, a lot of times the actions and personalities that were unlikable might be a reflection of something that I don't like in myself. And so it projects in a dream, and it projects on people that are close to me or that are loved ones.
I see.
And so in the theory and the way to help is that, how did that make you feel? And what can you do as a person to not behave that way? So, and
I'll go picture on that next time this comes up.
And again, everyone's different. That's a theory. That's a working theory. My personal opinion is that, they're just terrible people. Not your wife, the person in the dream.
Well, I want to move on to a couple other things the time we have left. This is your first book?
It's my first book.
Well, tell us about the process for getting a book published.
Yeah,
And what happened?
It is not for the faint of heart, that's for sure. Again, I think I said earlier that I did this workshop with Crystal Moody, who's based here in Springfield, and she's an artist, and looked at ways to inject creativity into every day of my life. And at the time, I think this was 2017, I was working, I had 2 young children, and I just really needed a creative outlet for mental health and to feel productive personally. And so I decided, write about my dreams every day. This time I'm going to start illustrating about it. And so I did, and I tried different techniques, collage and abstract art and watercolor illustrations. And I posted it to Instagram every day. And I'd worked on it for about 2 years, and I was about to give up on it. And I have a writing group here in town, and I was meeting with them and said, I'm just done. I was going to go the self-publishing route. And I got really overwhelmed because it just seemed really overwhelming. I mean, it's a lot of work to self-publish. And so I was like, I'm just going to table it. And the next day I got an email from an editor at Workman Publishing, and I thought it was a joke or spam or something. And I asked my husband to look them up on LinkedIn. I was like, this can't be real. But sure enough, they reached out and asked if I'd be interested in compiling it into a book. And so I think from that point, it took about 2 years between signing the contract and then having it come out in my hands.
Was that what your expectation was? Was it harder than you thought it would be?
It was definitely harder than I thought because I didn't have a full book to give them, when they reached out. I had a bunch of interpretations and illustrations, and my editor and I decided to really focus on looking at dreams through a cultural and historical perspective. And so trying to take from all walks of life throughout time and history was a daunting procedure. And then, of course, we didn't want to whitewash it or devalue any of the groups that we highlighted in the book. And so just making sure that all of that was sensitive to the reader. And it was just more work than I imagined in a good way. It was super challenging. But during the time that I was working on it, we were also dealing with a global pandemic. And that was, took a lot of mental space to overcome that hurdle. And then a lot of social unrest in our country. So it was just a really interesting time to have to hunker down and focus on this project that was truly just so exciting and so gratifying, and I was grateful for. And then, but also all these external factors. I was like, I can't be writing a book right now. This is so silly. So there's just a lot on my shoulders.
If you had to do all over again, would you do it?
I would love to keep writing and illustrating books, but I think I don't want to represent any cultures that I'm not actively involved in, because that wasn't, I don't think, my story to tell, but it was really, I learned so much, and it was such a great project, and I would definitely do another book again. But
what might be a subject matter?
Well, I actually just started tinkering around with one that goes back to my professional history here in town. Was that when my husband and I started the Moxie, he was blogging about the whole process, and it, before we even opened, he chronicled all of the trials and errors of trying to start your own business and movie theater. And it had been a successful blog. It was featured like a Google blog of note back in 2005 or something. So I'm trying to compile all of that information that he has just floating on the internet somewhere into one source, so that if anything, our kids can read through it and learn, but it might be fun for the community as well.
What advice would you give somebody that would like to write a book?
And it's funny, I love listening to the podcast. And so I was listening to the Nancy Allen one because I think she's so great. And one of the things that she talked about was how it's a combination of hard work and luck, because the publishing industry is vast, but it's also really hard to break into. So you have to have that hard work before the luck hits. And I think that was something she said. And I thought that was really, that's spot on. You've got to work hard. You've got to put the time in, and you've got to, be diligent with that. But then at some point, hopefully luck will happen too, and it all works out.
So in my mind, I'm thinking, is it a cart before the horse sort of thing? Do I pitch several potential publishers on a subject matter, or do I sit down and write my great American novel and then send it out to sea and hope somebody finds it and likes it?
I think of it at both. And I think what's weird right now, we're living in a time, like you said, with internet and everything. I was found through social media. Right now, artists and writers, they have to also be their own brand expert and marketing and agent and, all of the things. And that can get pretty exhausting. But I think as you're also working on your creative project, writing your book, you have to also be thinking, how am I going to share this? Sharing your work is the most important part, as gut-wrenching as that can be. Because I know a lot of writers, we write because it's a solitary endeavor. Mm-hmm. But I think you have to put yourself out there in order to get to that next level, at least.
Well, you know quite a bit about this. I believe you told me one time that you got a journalism degree, University of Missouri at Columbia, and you do freelance writing and that sort of thing, and you're very creative. What's that like, trying to make a go of it here in Springfield?
Unfortunately for me, I couldn't survive financially on my own as a author because I was really fortunate. I got an advance, and it was when I saw that number on paper, I was like, oh my goodness. And but then of course the fine print, it's parsed out over the course of 3 years. And so when you look at that, then the hours you put into the work, it's probably less than, a few dollars an hour at that point.
Right.
And then as far as like royalties go, I don't know if I'll ever see any royalties from the book, but to me that part wasn't necessary because that wasn't, I don't do this to make money necessarily. I do it because I love to create. I am really grateful that I can, in Springfield especially, be active in the writing community, working as a freelancer, also working on creative projects, and it be sustainable for my needs right now. And I've talked to a few different people who are doing great and they can make an entire career out of it. So I think that's really exciting.
I can't end our podcast today without asking you to tell us a little bit about the Springfield Arts Council.
Oh, yeah. That's like one of my passions. I worked there for a few years, but before I even worked there, I was on committees. And the Arts Council, I give them credit for being the resource that helped me get over the hurdle of showing my work publicly. I had created for years and years, but I had never shown it anywhere. And then through the Arts Council with their rotating galleries and opportunities, I submitted some work and it got shown. And I was like, oh, that's not hard. I can do that. And I've sold a few pieces through them. And so through them, I got to know the leadership and the board. And then the job opening came up. And so I begged to work for them. And now they can't get rid of me. I'm no longer employed for them, but I helped do some reporting for them with the Daily Citizen as kind of the umbrella. So that's a fun project. We're talking about arts integration today, this morning, and how important it is in the schools. So it's just a really great organization we have here in the community.
Now, folks, I didn't ask her to plug the Daily Citizen, but we do appreciate it.
It's a great resource.
Nicole, it's been great having you as our guest today.
Oh, well, thank you.
For our podcast in our town.
Well, I appreciate your time and happy dreaming.
That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/innertown or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.